I loved climbing trees as a child. I've had a knack for it ever since I was a toddler. Mum always used to call me her little monkey whenever she'd find me sitting among the branches of the giant oak in our backyard. I miss her so much. Mum passed away when I was 7 years old. She'd lost a 5-year battle with breast cancer. I had to watch as she withered away right in front of my eyes. I wanted so badly to help her, to ease her pain, to find a cure, but I failed. I absolutely adored my mother. She was so strong, even when her body was shutting down and the radiation was making every day a living nightmare. She always wore a smile on her face. Mum was such a positive influence in my life. When I was with her, I felt like I could do anything. She was a star shining bright in the endless sea of black. And when her light was snuffed out, all that darkness came crashing down on me. Dad didn't take Mum's passing well. I'd always thought he was someone I could lean on, someone safe. But the bottle turned him bitter. Dad couldn't go more than a few hours without a drink. Even now, I can't picture him without a beer in his hand. It got to the point where he didn't keep track of me anymore. He stopped caring about me, and that left me ample time to act out. For me, that wasn't vandalising property or smoking weed or shoplifting like any other troubled kid might do. No, for me, getting into trouble was stealing eggs. Such a strange coping mechanism, right? Somehow, I found it therapeutic. That fateful day was no different. Bingo! I yelled, hoisting myself up to eye level with a bird's nest tucked into the corner of a bough on the tree I was climbing. A single speckled egg was nestled within. I pumped my fist and snatched it. I was careful not to crack the egg as I descended the branches. That part would come later. I jumped down the last few feet, landing on the leaf-littered ground with a soft thump. A wide grin plastered itself across my lips. This was going to be fun. I cocked back my arm and aimed for a nearby birch, but right before I let it fly, I felt something. A small crack was erupting across the egg-spotted surface. I lowered my arm, staring incredulously at the little creature trying to break free from its prison. This had never happened before. I was awestruck. I watched as a jet-black beak emerged, slowly chipping away at the brittle shell. Soon, a bulbous head followed, and eventually, the hatchling was in full view. Ugly little thing, I thought to myself. Though it looked a bit repulsive, I couldn't bring myself to abandon it. I didn't know if the mother would reject the baby after I'd touched it, but I didn't want to find out. I shuffled home with it, plucking some earthworms from the dirt along the way. I didn't know much about birds, but in my mind, I was this little one's new parent. By the time I arrived home, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, bathing the sky in a beautiful blend of orange and purple and pink. As quietly as I could, I pulled open the screen door. I clutched the bird close to my chest as I softly shut the door behind me. The gentle click sounded thunderous to my ears. I prayed that Dad hadn't heard me. I apprehensively peeked my head around the doorframe to the living room. Dad was snoring in his armchair. His meaty hand was dangled close to the ground, a half-empty bottle of Cause leaking its contents onto the stained carpet. Perfect. I tiptoed to my room, careful not to wake Dad. The last thing I needed was for him to catch me red-handed. I didn't want to know what he'd do to my new pet if he found it, and I wasn't planning to find out. I grabbed an old t-shirt and a shoebox and crafted a little makeshift nest. I delicately placed the baby bird inside. It looked so fragile and helpless. Its eyes were squeezed shut, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of pity upon seeing its featherless body. I placed the worms in the container by the windowsill and turned back to the hatchling. "Don't go anywhere," I'll be right back with some water. I told it as if it could understand me. I crept to the kitchen and grabbed a glass, ensuring that the water was flowing as silently as possible. Once I was done, I made my way back to my room. I reached for the knob, but stopped. "Jack." My father's raspy voice echoed through the house. My hands began to tremble as I turned to face him. Dad was sitting up now. He downed the remainder of his beer and made eye contact with me. His sickly yellow sclerers sent a shiver running down my spine. "Yes, Dad?" He scanned me up and down, then huffed. "Go get me another beer." I nodded and did as I was told. I hesitantly extended a fresh course to him. Dad went straight past the beer and grabbed my wrist instead. He pulled me in close and studied my expression. I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "What were you doing out in those woods today?" "Nothing, Ow!" Pain streaked across my left cheek. Tears began to well in my eyes. "Don't lie to me, boy. I'm going to ask you one more time, and you better tell me the truth. What were you doing out in those woods?" "I was climbing trees, that's all. I promised, Dad, that was it," I sobbed, tears streaming down my cheeks. He released his grasp, and I instinctively tumbled back. He glared at me, those hazy, resentful eyes boring a hole into my chest. "All right, but if I find out that you're lying, I'll whip your ass until you can't sit for a month. Now get out of my sight." I scampered to my room, careful not to slam the door. I placed the water on my nightstand and slumped into bed. I screamed into my pillow. I screamed and screamed until my throat was raw. Why couldn't Dad just leave me alone? I wasn't a bad kid. After I finished letting it all out, I wiped my face and sniffled, glancing at the baby bird lying in its shoebox. I smiled weakly at it. "At least you're okay." I awoke the next morning to the tantalising aroma of eggs and bacon wafting from the kitchen. I groggily opened my eyes and peered into the shoebox that lay on the nightstand. My new friend was snoozing soundly. "I need a name for you," I said, leaning against my headboard. "I've got it. I'll call you Lucky because you're my lucky charm." What a perfect name, I thought as I threw on a t-shirt. I shuffled into the kitchen to find Dad putting the finishing touches on breakfast. "Scrambled, right?" he asked, placing a plate before me. "Yep, thanks, Dad," I said, shoveling a forkful of food into my mouth. Dad didn't cook breakfast much. I'd come to realise that it was sort of his way of apologising. "No problem, kiddo. Eat up or you'll be late for the boss," he replied, flashing me a warm smile. I knew what he was doing. I wasn't stupid. Not by any means. Deep down, I was fully aware that a hot meal didn't even begin to make up for what Dad had done to me. But in all honesty, I was just glad to share a moment with my father where he wasn't drowning his sorrows. That day at school, I couldn't stop thinking about Lucky. How could I determine if a bird was a boy or a girl? What species was Lucky? And more importantly, how could I make sure that Dad never found out? I was determined to keep my secret safe, no matter what. That little bird was mine now, and it was my job to protect it. I beelined straight for my room when I made it off the bus. I threw open the door, half expecting to find an empty shoebox. But when my eyes fell to my nightstand, my jaw hit the floor. Lucky was sitting in the exact same spot. Only now, the hatchling was staring at me. But that shouldn't have been possible, right? I rushed over to the shoebox and scooped up the baby bird. Black feathers coated nearly the entirety of Lucky's skin. Birds don't develop that quickly. I should have taken that as a sign that my new pet wasn't normal. Growing like a weed was an understatement. When I awoke the next morning, I felt something pitter-pattering across my chest. My heart fluttered as my eyes shot open. I soon came to the realization that the tiny taps I felt were talons. Lucky peered back at me, head curiously cocked to the side. "Good morning, buddy. How'd you— Wait! You got bigger," I murmured, studying my pet. Now, Lucky was the size of a grapefruit. But how? Lucky's eyes suddenly fixated on something to my right. The bird's gaze was locked, unwavering. I slowly traced its stare. The container of worms had been tipped over, and there were none left. "Oh, I get it. You're hungry. I'll go get you some breakfast," I said, leaping from my bed and carefully sliding my door open. I glanced back at Lucky and placed a finger over my mouth in a shushing motion. My feather friend obviously didn't respond. I tiptoed out of my room and past Dad's armchair, where he was slumbering soundly. I didn't make a peep as I retrieved a box of Cheerios from the cupboard. I silently crept back to my room. Dad stared, sending fear jolting through my chest. He rolled onto his side and continued snoring loudly. I breathed a sigh of relief. I didn't need Dad accusing me of stealing food. Lucky hopped over to me. I began to trickle Cheerios from my hand, giggling as the bird eagerly gobbled them up. I was really starting to get attached to my new friend. I should have known better. I somehow managed to keep Lucky hidden from Dad for another week. Lucky was growing insanely quickly, but perhaps even stranger, the animal never made a sound. Not one peep. It was almost as if Lucky knew how important it was to stay silent. I was thankful for that. After 8 days with my feathered friend, my room was beginning to look like a mess. Lucky was about 3 feet tall at that point. My pet's appetite was growing right along with it. I was having to get more and more creative with how I was feeding Lucky. Dad and I only had so many boxes of cereal. I started sneaking out of my window with Lucky. There was a lake not far from my house. I would take my fishing pole in one hand and a string tied to Lucky's leg in the other, and we would set off. I wouldn't catch many fish, but my meagre haul would seem to tide Lucky over nonetheless. The pair of us were returning from a particularly relaxing fishing session when it happened. I had the day off from school, so Lucky and I stayed out later than usual. I was so naive. I had just climbed back into my window, prepared to hoist Lucky up right after me. But before I could, I froze. "Where were you?" My blood turned to ice as Dad's low, wrathful voice met my ears. I shivered as I turned to face him. Dad's face was as red as a fire engine. "Lucky, run!" I whispered, as Dad's thunderous footsteps rattled the floor beneath me. Tears began to brim in the corners of my eyes as Dad loomed over me. I shrunk back against the window. Suddenly, white-hot pain seared through my cheek. I sobbed uncontrollably, begging Dad to stop. "Dad, please, He hit me again. I cried out, cradling my stinging face. "I know what you were doing. You were planning on leaving me, just like your mother," he snarled, unbuckling his belt and pulling it through his weathered belt loops. "I wasn't, I swear! Please, Dad, you have to believe me!" Crack. Dad swung the belt. I reflexively blocked it with my arms. It hurt so badly, but I couldn't afford to lower them. Crack, crack, crack. Again and again and again. Dad wielded the belt like a lion tamer's whip, relentlessly lashing my trembling body. I apologized. I cried. I pleaded with him, whatever I could think of to make him stop. But nothing worked. "Dad, please! I would never leave you! I love you!" I screamed, praying that he would see reason. "That's what," crack, "your mother," crack, "said too." I couldn't think of anything else to say. I was left with no other choice but to endure the beating. Dad didn't lower his belt until he was out of breath, and my arms were a bloody mess. I lay in a heap on the floor, hyperventilating, as Dad glared coldly down at me. He left me there, grumbling to himself as he went. He turned back to me, his fiery gaze burning into my chest. "Clean up this room, and if you ever try leaving again, I will make you regret the day you were born." I winced as the door slammed shut, leaving me alone once again. I didn't get up for a long time. I silently wailed, nursing my raw, bloody wounds. By the time I'd picked myself up off the floor, it was well past midnight. I cleaned myself up and passed out from sheer exhaustion the moment my head hit the pillow. I decided to leave the window open, on the off chance that Lucky might decide to come back. I awoke the next day, and my room was just how I'd left it. It was still a disaster, but there was no sign of Lucky. I grimaced as I leaned up, noting that my arms were coated in bandages. On top of that, the distinct aroma of eggs and bacon was wafting through my bedroom door. I slunk out of bed and shuffled into the kitchen. I was going to have to face Dad eventually, and it was best not to anger him by letting my meal go cold. Dad greeted me with a smile as I claimed my seat at the table. "How'd you sleep last night, buddy?" he asked, his tone a bit too enthusiastic. "Fine," I mumbled, trying to hide my tattered arms. "Scrambled okay?" he replied, placing a plate of steaming eggs and bacon before me. "Yeah," I stared despondently at my breakfast. I wasn't hungry, but I knew I had to eat. Dad piled food into his mouth, hurriedly scarfing down his meal. He paused and glanced up at me. "So, about last night," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "If anyone asks, you... I fell. A sense of ease settled over Dad's features. "I was playing in the woods and I fell into a ravine. I couldn't bring myself to look him in the eyes. Dad ruffled my hair. That's a good boy." He didn't need to worry about excuses. After the third or fourth incident, my teacher stopped asking about the bruises. I think she knew. She knew, but she was too afraid of the backlash she'd receive if she spoke out. I don't blame her. She didn't understand the full extent of what was going on. I didn't see Lucky for a while after that. I was beginning to worry that I'd never see my pet again. Did Lucky abandon me? Did my bird find a new little boy to stay with? Or worse, what if Lucky was hurt somewhere and I had no idea? After a week and a half with no sign of my feathered friend, I couldn't take it anymore. I was aware of the consequences if Dad found out, but I needed to know that Lucky was okay. I decided to go searching through the woods after school that Wednesday. Dad usually left me to my own devices for the entire evening on school days. I again climbed out of my window, praying that Dad would be none the wiser. I set out at dusk. The sky was a gorgeous cocktail of colours, pink and purple and orange, just like it was on the day that I'd brought Lucky home. I searched for hours, but the only sounds that met my ears were the crunching of the leaves under my feet and my own voice reverberating off the trees. "Lucky! Lucky, where are you? Lucky!" I repeated the process until my lungs grew tired. I searched everywhere I could think of. I even circumnavigated the whole lake, to no avail. I knew that I couldn't stay out there forever. It was well past my bedtime when I dejectedly made my way back home. It felt like someone had torn out a piece of my heart. Lucky was my best friend, my only friend. I didn't want to be alone again. I made it back to my room without incident. I was able to slip in the window and slide it shut without awakening the bear. I plopped down onto my bed, quickly swiping away the tear that had begun to trickle down my cheek. How could Lucky leave me like that? "You want to go? Fine. Stay gone," I muttered, rolling onto my side. I was ripped from my stupor by the sound of my rumbling stomach. I'd been so preoccupied with finding Lucky that dinner hadn't even crossed my mind. I snuck over to the door, hoping to pilfer some leftovers from the fridge. I was starving. I lightly pushed open my door with bated breath. I slipped out of my room and tiptoed past Dad's armchair. He was facing away from me, but it sounded like he was fast asleep.
You'd better have a damn good reason for leaving that room.
I froze. My appetite suddenly vanished. My whole body began to tremble as I slowly turned around. This couldn't be happening. Not again. I was just playing in the woods. I promise.
Lies!
Dad spun to face me. He was angrier than I'd ever seen him. His muscles were tense, and I could see a vein protruding from his temple. He clutched an empty glass bottle in his hand so tightly that I thought it would smash to pieces at any moment.
I told you that you'd regret leaving. I meant that,
Dad said, tears welling at the corners of his eyes. His expression softened slightly. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he smashed the bottle against the wall. He pointed the sharp, jagged remains at me, setting my heart pounding like a jackhammer.
You want to leave so bad? Well, I can't lose you. Not like your mother. So I'm going to make sure that you never leave again.
Dad took a step towards me. My eyes grew wide as dinner plates. Dad was walking like he was underwater, each slow footfall bringing him slightly closer to me. He was mere feet away when finally my fight or flight response kicked in. My brain chose flight. I darted through the kitchen and threw open the door. Dad wasn't walking slowly anymore. He was chasing after me. I sprinted from the house with Dad hot on my heels. Though I knew he was hammered, Dad was gaining on me. It was as if the alcohol only steeled his resolve. I ran as fast as my little legs could carry me, guided only by the moonlight trickling through the canopy overhead. The cold burned my cheeks as I bolted past countless shadowy rocks and trees. Dad was beginning to close the gap. I just had to get away. I could see the clearing to the lake not far ahead. If I could make it there, I was confident that I could escape. Dad had never learned how to swim. 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5. My lungs screamed at me to stop, but the adrenaline was propelling me forward. I was so close. Right as my feet crossed the threshold, my foot caught on a root protruding through the dried leaves. To my horror, I was sent sprawling to the ground. That gave Dad the perfect opportunity to strike.
You're a fast little bastard, I'll give you that,
he panted, hands on his knees.
You've had your fun, but now it's over. It's all over. I'm gonna make us one big happy family again. Me, you, and your mother.
The moonlight glinted off the jagged edges of the bottle as Dad towered over me. My brain was racing 1,000,000 miles an hour. This couldn't be the end. I had so much that I still wanted to experience. So much life that I wasn't going to get to live. And then I heard it. The flapping of wings. I squeezed my eyes shut and screamed as loudly as I could muster. Lucky! Help! I felt a massive gust of wind sweep the leaves beneath me as I opened my eyes. Dad had his back turned to me. His jaw fell open at the sight of the monstrous bird before him. Lucky stared down at him coldly. The animal was easily 7 feet tall, with a wingspan that I couldn't even fathom. Enormous was an understatement. Dad was paralysed. By shock or fear, I don't know. But I couldn't be more thankful for my feathered friend at that moment.
What the?
He never got a chance to finish that sentence. Lucky's beak suddenly thrust forward and lodged into Dad's throat. Blood spewed from the open wound as he crumpled to the ground. I'll never forget the wet gargles that escaped his lips as he took his dying breaths. And those eyes. Dad's glossy, exanimate eyes met mine as his life faded away. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I raced over to Lucky and threw my arms around the bird's gargantuan body. I sobbed into those jet-black feathers, releasing the concoction of emotions that had been bubbling inside of me. Rage, anguish, relief, they all flooded from my system like a tsunami. I felt Lucky's wings drape over me, as if embracing my quivering form, just like my mother used to do when I was little. Through my cries, I softly whispered, "I'm so glad you're okay. Thank you." I don't know how long we stayed like that, me wailing into the chest of my former pet, while the bird consoled me. It was almost healing in some way. Once I had no more tears left to cry, I released Lucky. I received one final nod from my friend, as if to say that everything would turn out all right, and then Lucky took off into the cloudless night sky. My aunt took me in after that. She'd had no idea what my father had been doing to me, or I'm confident that she would have taken me away sooner. She gave me a good life, a better life, one that my dad never could. I still think about Lucky from time to time. My aunt kept the house that I grew up in and gifted it to me when I turned 18. I go back there every once in a blue moon. I like to sit by the lake and think of all the fond memories I made there. Unfortunately, I haven't seen Lucky since that night. I don't know if our paths will ever cross again, but I hope that my feathered friend is doing well. I have a feeling that Lucky is thriving, because sometimes, if I listen closely, I can make out the sound of giant wings flapping in the distance.